Okay, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We're excited to have this program about Toussaint uh, Louverture. And we're excited to have Philippe Girard. Philippe Girard is a professor of history at McNeese State in Louisiana and the author of 4 books on Haitian history. A native of the Caribbean, he studied in France and the United States. In 2014, he was a research fellow at the Du Bois Institute at Harvard University. And we'll get to his presentation.
All right, can everybody hear me? Hello?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. All right. Well, good evening to all. My apologies for not having my pretty face on the screen. Somehow I don't seem to be able to handle that. The part that is important, however, would be the slides that are in front of you that will allow you to follow the story a bit better. What I want to do tonight is talk about this remarkable man that you see on the screen, Touissaint Louverture. And you may have heard of him before. He is generally best known as the leading figure of the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in the history of the world, which is important because Haiti, back in the 18th century, when it was known as the French colony of Saint-Domingue, was a leading exporter of sugar and coffee in the world. And it was the most viable colony in the Americas, much more viable, for example, than the 13 colonies that eventually became the US. He is arguably the most significant person in African descent in world history, but surprisingly little work of quality has been done about him. If you go to a library and look for a biography in English, up until recently, the 2 leading choices for you would have been those 2 books. The one on the left by C.L.R. James was really a groundbreaking work when it first came out, but that was back in 1908, so not exactly cutting-edge research. The second by Madison Smart Bell is more recent, and it reads pretty well because the author is an English professor, a novelist. But precisely because that author is a novelist, it is based on limited archival research, and some chapters are drawing more from fiction than actual research. So that's why about 15 years ago, I decided that I would throw my hat in the ring, and dig a bit deeper, especially about the early part of the life of Toussaint Louverture before the outbreak of the Great Haitian Revolution, because we know very little about what represents the bulk of his life. But anyway, so if you decide to write the great Toussaint biography, as I did, where do you start? And most people ask me, well, a simple question: what did the man look like? And that's also a difficult answer. The most frequently reproduced portrait is the one you see here, which dates back to the part of the time of the Revolution. And he looks somewhat similar in this portrait on a horse, which is also from the Revolutionary era. But his son, Isaac Louverture, portrayed here, was adamant that the portraits you saw before were not accurate, and they were just racist caricatures. So this is a portrait that his son preferred, the one where Toussaint Louverture looks suspiciously European, even though both of his parents were born in Africa. And some other portraits by 19th century abolitionists lighten his skin even further, while recent versions in Haiti tend to go the other way and darken his skin. So we're kind of lost. What is the real Toussaint Louverture? Is this man over here, this portrait, this portrait, this portrait, this portrait, this one, or maybe this one? Unless it is this one. So you already see a pattern emerging here. If you favor slavery, as people did in the late 18th or 19th century, people will go to the portrait on the left. They'll try to make him dark, menacing, and somewhat ugly looking. But people who are abolitionists tend to make him so white, as the portrait is on the right, that he looks less threatening, but also doesn't look like what he was, a person of African descent. And if you are a Haitian nationalist, and there are quite a few of them today in Haiti, they tend to prefer the portrait at the bottom in the center because that celebrates his heroic blackness. So in other words, all these portraits that you've seen, they say more about the political agenda of the artist making the portrait, many of whom I've never met Louverture, and they say fairly little about what Touissaint Louverture actually looked like himself. So luckily, after a lot of research, I was able to uncover what might be is the one true portrait of Touissaint Louverture. And to me, that would be this, a Rorschach test, because to me, he is what you make of him. And just in passing, the reality is that Touissaint Louverture always refused to sit for a portrait. And that's why we don't know what he looked like. He did not want us to. So that's a problem we'll encounter a lot as biographers, is that he was a very secretive person. So we must satisfy ourselves with portraits such as the one that I used for the cover of my book, which at least date from the Revolutionary era and may be somewhat accurate, but there are a few caveats attached to it. Another option you could use if you want to explore Touissaint Louverture and the portraits are not so good is to use archaeology. Just go back to the places where he lived. And that would be modern day Haiti, known in his time as a French colony of Saint-Domingue. So he was born to what is today Cape Haitian to the north, back then Cap Français. This is what the city looks like today, beautiful city surrounding the bay of Cape Haitian. And the region was home to a lot of sugar plantations, kind of in the flatlands you see to the top right. All the way to the right would be where he grew up. He was born around 1743 on the Breda plantation. And if you go to that spot, well, you'll see a whole bunch of nothing. I mean, not quite nothing. There's a high school on the spot, which is named after him, of course, but it's a much more recent development. If you go back behind the high school where the students go and hang out, this is the remnant of the plantation where Touissaint Louverture grew up. And at the bottom, you might see some remnants of a wall that used to be there. And that's it. This is all that remains of the plantation where this great man spent the first 45 years of his life. So as a person trying to do a dig, and if you want to maybe go to the end part of his life, then you will head to France, because that is where he ended his life, in captivity, specifically at the Fort de Joux, that would be on the French-Swiss border to the right of this map. The fort is still there. It's quite an impressive site. And you can even go and visit the cell where he died, and he spent the last few months of captivity. But the fort was heavily remodeled in the late 19th century, so his body was lost in the process, and we are faced with a ghost, a person whose presence is felt everywhere, in Haiti, in France, and yet he is nowhere. So that's the time as a historian to pull the last card of my sleeve, and that would be archival documents. And typically when you do the history of slavery, the documentary evidence is poor because history is written by the winners. So most historians of slavery have to deal with plantation records and whatever the colonists have to say about slavery. But here we're dealing with a Haitian Revolution, the one and only one where the slaves actually won. So the history is sometimes written by the winners, actually the slaves in that case. So the archival record is vast and almost overwhelming for historians because it is quite widely scattered. So the papers of the son of Touissaint Louverture, Isaac, they are the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. But the papers of the plantation where he grew up, they would be in Nantes and Bordeaux and various regional archives in France. But notarial records about his early life when he was a free man of color, that would be in Aix-en-Provence, portrayed here. Early in the revolution, he fought in the Spanish army, so you have to make a detour through Seville and Valladolid and Madrid in Spain. But then at some point in his life, he joined the French army, and the archives are in this old medieval castle in Paris. When he was leader of Haiti, he had diplomatic relations with the US and Britain, so you might have to head to College Park or Kew. And he did extensive commerce with American merchants, so another detour through Boston or Philadelphia or New York is necessary. Then there are some records about the French expedition through him. That would be at the University of Florida in Gainesville, and records on his captivity would be at the University of Puerto Rico. And yet another important memoir about his life would be in the Archives Nationales in Paris. So it's great to rack up all these frequent flyer miles and enjoy all these beautiful places, just not easy to put all that together. One good point is that Toussaint Louverture was literate. At least later in his life, he taught himself how to read and write. And at the very end of his life, when he was in captivity, he wrote memoirs about his life. That's what you see. It's kind of hard to read, but it says Mémoire du Général Toussaint Louverture. So for once, we have an account by a person who led the only successful slave revolt in world history. And I remember when I first found the original version of that document a few years back, the one that was written in his own hand in the French National Archives, it was quite an exciting and moving moment. But then when I started reading the document, it was also mostly notable for what it lacked. Again, it's a secretive person that tried to hide a lot about his past. The passage that I put in a brown box there towards the bottom says, if you manage to read it, j'ai été esclave, j'ose l'avancer. I was a slave, I dare to say so. And that short sentence is the only mention he made in the memoir of his entire pre-revolutionary life. So that's almost 50 years of his life right there, which he purposely sidestepped. So who was he? Because that was the main point of my book, is to try to figure out who he was before the revolution. And so let's start with his ancestry, where he came from, or his parents. And we have access to some family traditions through his son. And according to those traditions, Toussaint Louverture was a grandson of a man called Gaou Guinou, who was a king of the Alaba ethnic group in what is today Benin, Africa. But if you look at local lineages of king in the area, there is no trace of that supposed king. So most likely that's all made up. Gaou is how they call regional officials in that kingdom. So that suggests to me that the grandfather of Toussaint Louverture was an aristocrat rather than a king. And it kind of enlivened the family tree a bit. There is now a statue of Toussaint Louverture in Benin. He was not born there, his parents were. But I'm not even sure if Toussaint Louverture would have liked it. His parents were born in Africa, but Toussaint Louverture was not an African nationalist in the modern sense of the term. He himself was a Creole, a second-generation slave who was born in the Caribbean. And so he tried to distance himself from his African roots, which would have been considered shameful in a slave society. He did learn how to speak the West African Fon language from his parents, but rarely used it as an adult because, again, he's trying to show that he was a Creole, a person born in the Caribbean. So he would have used Haitian Creole, the current language of Haiti, which is a mix of African languages and French. He and his wife also learned standard European Parisian French and even how to read and write, but they always struggled. And if you read so that letter there from his wife to him, it would be littered with French grammatical mistakes. They never were formally schooled. You have some historians like Madison Smarbell who argue that he was a big practitioner of voodoo, the Haitian religion with African roots, but I found no evidence for it, quite the opposite. In this plantation register that I found with a colleague, you'll find a description next to his name of who he is, and you encounter the words saying that he was a sweet but very overly religious, a zealot who had a tendency to proselytize and try to spread catechism about the Catholic Church. So in my book, he was a devout Catholic rather than looking back to voodoo and the religion from Africa. In public, he never spoke about the experience of his parents going through the Middle Passage because they endured that Middle Passage. The only thing I did notice is that as an adult, he was afraid of going on the water to travel on ships. So I assume that he had heard some horror stories from his parents when he was a kid. Instead, the world that was his was not the world of Africa that he tended to reject, but the world of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, aka Haiti, a Creole world of the Caribbean. Specifically, that's in the North, Cap Français, aka Cape Haitian. You see the city here, the port, the plantation have been to the left on that drawing, and the sugar plantation that belonged to the Breda family. Them in gray on that map, the one where he was born and grew up is the one that is closest to Cap Français, the one that says Breda, Haut du Cap. And that's where he was born around 1743 of two enslaved parents who had been brought from Benin, Africa. If you want to look up who Toussaint Louverture was and where he was born, Wikipedia will show up and they'll give you a very specific date for his birth, May 20th, 1743. The reality is that no birth certificate or baptismal certificate was ever found. So the date is, even the year is very imprecise. Actually, his first name was Toussaint, which means All Saints' Day in French. We just celebrated that holiday yesterday. So I actually think he was born on All Saints' Day, November 1st. And as for the year, I'm not that sure because he mentioned several ages that conflicted in the 1790s. One thing that is important when you read slave narratives, like, I don't know, that of Frederick Douglass, is the trope of the awakening, the time when the slave child realizes that he is not a regular boy or girl, but that he is a slave. And Toussaint Louverture was a very guarded person, never publicly reflected on that moment. But if I had to take a guess, I would date that moment to 1754, when his owner at the time died, and the estates of the owner were split three ways between her children. And as a way to even out the shares between what the siblings had inherited, they exchanged back and forth some cash and some slaves, and no doubt breaking apart many families in the process. And to me, this sad day when you have parents, enslaved parents who are torn from their enslaved children, all that for the benefit of some absentee owners that they had never met, that must have been the moment where Toussaint Louverture must have realized what it meant to be a chattel, to be property. And he would have been about 10 years old at that time. Slavery in French colonies was governed by something called the Black Code, the Code Noir, and usually it's presented today as this horrific document filled with branding and whipping and mutilation. And there is some truth to that. It is indeed cruel. Well, during my research, I encountered that document, which was quite surprising. It is the fee schedule for the executioner, a person who himself was a black slave who was expected to carry out all the executions and tortures of slaves who rebelled. So there's a fee for that. 30 pounds if you're going to hang somebody, 60 pounds if you're going to break a slave on the wheel, break all his limbs, 120 pounds if you're going to burn the slave, and go on and on it goes. And these executions were public. That's the point. So Toussaint Louverture, as a young man, must have witnessed some pretty horrible scenes in his youth. Thinking especially of the execution of a voodoo leader named McCandle, who was burnt alive in 1729, right in front of the church of Cape Haitian. That's the church where Toussaint Louverture went to church every Sunday. You see the present version of that church in Cape Haitian on that photo that I took. But you have to remember that laws passed by the king, like the Black Code, were frequently ignored in the Caribbean. So you always have to look at the reality of the law. And for that, we're kind of lucky because the plantation where he grew up was an absentee-owned plantation. So you have an abundant series of letters between the person who was a manager of the plantation on the site and then the various absentee owners who typically lived in Paris. And those letters show a more complex reality, showing that slavery was a story of violence, obviously, but also of collaboration and resistance. Under the Black Code, masters were not allowed to have sex with their slaves. That would have been an un-Catholic thing to do, and that would have amounted to an additional form of exploitation beyond the labor exploitation. Except, of course, that they did on a regular basis, and there were a number of slaves on the plantation that Toussaint Louverture grew up on. And one of them was related to him. A few years ago, I encountered that document that you see here, and that document indicates that the daughter of Toussaint Louverture, who was black, had a mixed race child when she was a young teenager. So I spent quite a bit of time looking at a document, trying to make sense of it when I first encountered that. You know, how do you make sense of that? By having sex with a white man, obviously, and bearing a mixed race child, was this young woman, the daughter of Toussaint Louverture, trying to seduce her master to get her freedom, because that's the way male contemporaries would have described it in the accounts. Or are we dealing here with statutory rape, since she was a young woman and she had no way of saying no when a white man wanted to have sex with her? That's probably how we would look at it nowadays. Also, that document indicated that she bought and freed her child, because that's actually a manumission document. So to free her child, the mixed race child that she had with a white man, she bought him. Apparently, for some reason, she obtained her freedom, for whatever reason that was. And then her child, who was born when she was still a slave, was still enslaved himself. So the daughter of Toussaint Louverture had to buy her child after the fact so that she could free him, which is something we have a hard time wrapping our mind around nowadays. Sick of that, buying your own child. And I always think also about the collateral victims beyond the young women. For example, the black men who felt emasculated by this kind of appropriation. For example, Toussaint Louverture, the grandpa of that mixed race child who had failed to protect his daughter from some white rapist. And he never discussed that later on either. But I did notice that much later, when he became powerful during the Haitian Revolution, he often had affairs with the wives of white planters. So my guess would be that it was payback time, and that sex was a way to express power. So as part of slavery, you have violence, rape, but you also have collaboration. And the plantation records surprisingly describe Toussaint Louverture as a model slave. The manager of the plantation loved him. And that's kind of surprising for a man who later led the largest slave revolt in Caribbean history, or world history for that matter. So clearly he was a man who was hiding his true feelings for safety reasons, and that ability to deceive others, that's kind of a handy gift for a politician, and that remained with him throughout his life. To me, he was an actor, a graduate of the Juilliard School of slavery, if you will. So you do have some violence, you do have some collaboration, but you also have some resistance. And I noticed when going through the record of the Breda plantation where he grew up, that those slaves were particularly unruly. And whenever they were unhappy, they would run away as a group, especially to the hills that you see behind the plantation. And then they would only return as a group after management had given in to whatever the demands were. And as a French person looking at it, I couldn't help but chuckle because to me, that made them very, very French. They're going to strike whenever they're not happy with management. And apparently got away with it. And that resistance could go beyond just a mere strike or running away, marooning. It could be more physical. The executioner that I mentioned earlier, well, there's a case one day when the slaves of that plantation lynched the executioner of Cap Français right there on the main road, right in front of the plantation. And even Toussaint Louverture himself, even though he's a cautious rebel later in his life, could fight back earlier in his life when he's a more hot-headed young man. We have accounts of twice him as a teenager getting into physical confrontations with a white man from the plantation and somehow getting away with it, which surprises me because threatening to attack a white man or actually hitting him would have been very severely punished in Haiti. When writing about him, I tried to look at all the facets of his life, and being a family man was definitely a part of it. Even though Haiti was a terrible place to raise a family. It's a colony marked by slavery, disease, war, hurricanes, a sex ratio where men outnumbered women. So in this context, most male slaves in Haiti died alone and childless, like Ebony Flotsam washed ashore on the wrong side of the Atlantic. And yet, he is again different because Toussaint Louverture managed to marry, not once, but twice, and to father 16 children in all, either from his first wife, his second wife, or by other women. That's a family tree that I tried to put together, and it's a bit complicated. It would be at the center, and you see below him his first wife, Cecile, his second wife, Suzanne, and then other women, possibly. So you may have heard of his first wife, second wife, Suzanne, who lived with him throughout the revolution, is somewhat famous in Haiti. But he also had a previous wife named Cecile, whom he married when he was just 18, and whose existence only recently came to life. They had 3 kids together. You see them, Toussaint, Gabrielle, Marie-Marthe. The latter one is the one who had a mixed race child. And then he had some children by his second wife. One of them is adopted, and then many others. So that made him quite unusual, and he had plenty of godchildren as well. So clearly he was an important man, even as a slave. The job that he had as a slave was a coachman. He'd take care of the plantation's mules and horses and such. And for that reason, he often traveled to nearby plantations and to the city of Cap Français, the big commercial center in the north, which is portrayed here. And by going through the records, I was able to discover that he had probably met all the future leaders of the revolution during these travels, long before the revolution. Georges Biassou, who became a leading figure of the Haitian Revolution, well, his mother was enslaved at a nearby hospital that Toussaint Louverture visited. Henri Christophe, another very famous figure in Haiti, well, he worked at the restaurant that was on the road to that city. Jeannot, yet another famous leader of the revolution, well, he was a coachman, just like Toussaint Louverture, on an estate that was nearby. They probably bumped into each other. So when you read traditional accounts of the Haitian Revolution, it always looks as if major leaders pop out of nowhere because we don't know what their background is before the revolution. But according to my research, they all knew each other long before the revolution through Toussaint Louverture, as if he had been carefully preparing the groundwork for the uprising to come. We knew everything about Toussaint Louverture and his life as a slave before the revolution until this document was found in the 1970s. which referred to him as, quote, a free Negro. You can see it in the area that I have encircled, Toussaint Nègre Libre, a free Negro. Which is surprising because that document is from 1776. So long before the Haitian Revolution, he was no longer a slave. He's a freedman, mine officially blown. Also surprising is that this was not known during the Haitian Revolution. So how did he keep it a secret? Why did he keep it a secret? And my guess is that during the revolution, he did not want to tarnish his appeal among rebel slaves by revealing that he had actually been free for many years. It was kind of a way of protecting his credibility as a former slave, that he was also a slave fighting for his freedom. After his manumission, he had to face some important moral dilemma. Because now he could maybe work on trying to free other members of his family. So who should he help to free first? He could not free everybody. He had to make some choices. And in the year that followed, we see some evidence that his first wife, Cecile, became free. Also his daughter, Marie-Marthe, also his sister, and also his surrogate mother, Pélagie. And maybe you've noticed the pattern there. These are all women. And clearly they came first in his order of priorities, and I would think it's because slavery was matrilineal. It was passed through the mother's line, so it was important to free women, otherwise they would continue producing slaves for the master as long as they were enslaved. It's an interesting choice he had to make. Another part of his life that is important is that he was not just a freedman, but also a person who exploited slaves at some point. And that's probably the more controversial aspect of the life before the revolution. The document here is a lease whereby he rented a coffee estate from his son-in-law, and the list of people you have at the bottom are the certain slaves who live on that estate and that were leased to Touissaint Louverture. So amazingly, Touissaint Louverture, the father of the Haitian slave revolt, had once exploited slaves, and there's evidence that he owned a couple of them. And one discovery that I did make a few years ago is that one of these slaves was none other than Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who later became the second most important figure in the Haitian Revolution, and was a slave who was on a plantation leased by Touissaint Louverture when he was a freedman. That was a major discovery when I came across that, because that would be like saying Thomas Jefferson was once the indentured servant of George Washington. That would put their relationship in a completely different light. And I did see some resentment on the part of Jean-Jacques Dessalines toward Louverture much, much later. So once it became clear that Toussaint Louverture had been not just a slave but a freedman, some scholars now went from one extreme to the other, going from, oh, he was a humble slave to, well, maybe he was a wealthy free man of color, because there were some in Haiti who was owning a lot of slaves and a lot of plantations and hobnobbing with the elite. And to me, that would be going too far. Because that one coffee plantation that he rented from his son-in-law, that turned out to be a money pit. And during that period, his first wife left him for another man who was richer and lighter skinned. And so he was not your average field hand toiling in the sugar field on the one hand, but he was not a millionaire planter on the other hand either. I would portray him more as some ambitious young freedman trying to make his way into the world through difficult circumstances, a man in the crowd. And another question people have asked themselves is, well, what happened to Toussaint Louverture after he was freed? If he's no longer a slave, where is he? No longer on the plantation? Well, actually, he is still on the plantation. And that's a document that I and another scholar discovered a few years ago. It's a record of the plantation after he was freed, and his name is still on it. So clearly, after the failure of his coffee plantation lease business, he went back to work on the very plantation where he had once been enslaved. And his social status was so low that his name appeared alongside that of other slaves. And I'm not even sure that he was properly freed, because I have found no evidence of his legal manumission in the archives. That's a holy grail that I've looked for years, never found it. So in documents, Toussaint Louverture just said that he was free without providing the documentation for it, as if he could make it true by asserting this claim. And so that introduces an important idea that freedom and slavery were not a dichotomy. They were a continuum. On one hand, there were slaves, fully enslaved, others fully free people. And then in the middle, you had people that had been freed, or people like Toussaint Louverture who claimed to be free, were de facto free, but not fully legally free. The name in Haiti was Libre de Savane. And that explains a lot of his nuanced political views on slave labor during the revolution. He came from a complicated background. So as far as we know, this is what Toussaint Louverture was doing on the eve of the Haitian Revolution. He's a coachman, he's in charge of the mules and such, so he's maybe pushing those mules as they make their way around the sugar mill. So if you think of him as that wealthy freedman, his involvement in the Haitian slavery revolt would make no sense. But if you think of the fact that he still lived on the plantation as a de facto free person, but some members of his family were still enslaved, including his second wife that he married later on, and the two sons that you see here, one his biological son and the other one adopted, who are still enslaved, then the rationale for him being a slave rebel becomes evident. Maybe he was not a slave himself, family members were. The personal was very political. So by the time these years happened, 1789, Toussaint Louverture was around 45, which is well past the life expectancy of a slave, and he was still a nobody. And then, all of a sudden, the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 changed all that by introducing radical new concepts like all men are created and remain free and equal in rights. That would be Article 1 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is right here on the screen. So think of that. You're living as a black man on a plantation in a slave colony, surrounded by slave colonies, and someone tells you, here, the French metropolis just passed the Declaration of Rights of Man, and Article 1 says that all men, doesn't say white men, all men are created and remain free and equal in rights. That would have been groundbreaking. And of course, that takes us to the outbreak of Haiti's Great Slave Revolt 2 years into the French Revolution, August 1791. And the question is, well, what was his role in it? And some scholars have argued that maybe Toussaint Louverture had nothing to do with the initial slave revolt. I think he was there. This particular document in the Spanish archives explains, it's a fellow slave rebel, was the leader of the slave revolt, Georges Biassou, who explained that Toussaint Louverture was indeed there as a mastermind of revolt from the outset, but that Toussaint Louverture was very cautious, that he was afraid of being involved in a revolution, so he acted behind the scenes in case the revolt would fail. And there's another account that says Toussaint Louverture was, quote, hiding behind the curtain, unquote, which has a great analogy for what he was doing. And you might see that as cowardice, that he was not at the forefront of the slave revolt, but to me, I see it as simple prudence from a man in his 40s who's seen a lot of stuff in his life. After all, every single slave revolt in the history of the world had failed so far. And if the one in Haiti failed, which was pretty likely, by law, any kind of slave rebel would endure what you see on the screen. He would be tied to a cross of St. Andrew. Every bone in his body would be broken with an iron bar by the executioner. And then he would be tied to a wheel and be left to die in agony. That was a pretty common punishment in Haiti. So he stayed behind. As it turned out, he was no ordinary leader because the slave revolt that he organized was a very successful one. It involved about 50,000 slaves acting in unison in the fall of 1791. And eventually all the slaves of Haiti, about 500,000, joined in. And to give you a comparison, the largest slave revolt in U.S. history, which is near New Orleans in 1811, that involved no more than 500 rebels. So we're talking about a revolt in Haiti that was not 10 times larger, not 100 times larger, but 1,000 times larger. And early in the revolution, Toussaint Louverture, ever the cautious man, continued to proceed cautiously. He even offered France a deal. He said that if the top leaders and their family, like himself, could get their freedom officially, then he would convince the rank and file of the slaves to go back to work. And that deal actually fell through, but if it had succeeded, we would remember him today not as a great liberator of the slaves of Haiti, but as a man who kind of double-crossed them. I want to mention at the bottom left of the document, you see the word Toussaint, which I enlarged. That is the earliest writing sample that I have found so far. Apparently, that moment into his 40s in the revolution, that's when he apparently learned to read and write. So the French, as it turned out, could not defeat the rebels of that well-organized revolution, but the other way around also was true. The rebels could not defeat the French. So Toussaint Louverture and his army moved inland to what would be today the Dominican Republic, back then Spanish Santo Domingo, and eventually they joined the Spanish army. So the period of his life when he became a general in the Spanish army. which is odd because Spain at that time would have been a slave-owning power. So again, a very complex figure willing to do things out of political expediency. And amazingly, at that point, he had not yet made a public call for universal emancipation. He had led a rebellion, but had not called for the universal right of freedom for slaves. But by this point, the French were changing the policies as well. You have the idealism of the French Revolution, obviously, which made people question the legality of slavery. And on a more practical level, France had to face a major slave revolt that they couldn't extinguish, and then a major war against Britain and Spain, and both of these invaded the colony. So colonial authorities decided to just give up on slavery so that they could get the slaves on their side to fight against Spain and Britain. So the man who abolished slavery in Haiti was not Toussaint Louverture in the end, but the man you see here, a French commissioner, kind of like a governor, named Sonthonax. That would be in 1793. And at that point, Toussaint Louverture felt a bit angry because he thought that the revolution he had started was being stolen from him by some newly arrived revolutionary from France, Sonthonax. And at this point, when he writes things, he calls himself for the first time Touissaint Louverture, the overture. Remember that earlier on in his life, he only had a first name. That's what Toussaint was, a first name. Slaves did not have a full identity. They were known as Toussaint Breda in his case, after the owner of the plantation where they lived. So he made a name for himself. That's part of the revolutionary process. He learned how to read and write, and he gives himself a full identity. In that case, Louverture means the overture, the opening, to remind everybody that he had been the first person to open the way for slave liberation. And that remained his identity throughout his life. Every other document after that, you see him proudly giving the full name, Toussaint Louverture. He has a last name. And he also added those 3 dots, which traditionally were meant as a sign that you were a Freemason, although he may have been pretending to be part of a Freemason lodge as well. At that point, 1794, 3 years into the revolution, that's when he officially embraced universal abolition as his goal, and he switched the French army, which also had embraced the goal of freedom for everybody at the time, which is very radical. Think of the fact that the US would not have full abolition until 1865, Britain 1833, Brazil 1888. So it's a very radical moment for the time. And now he's started a new career in his life, a general of the French army. He's a man with many, many lives. And that would be the case pretty much until the very end of his life. And for him, that was an exciting moment in his life. Monuments dedicated to liberty sprung up from the ground all over Haiti. And at that time, Spain and Britain tried to invade Haiti to steal the colony from France and restore slavery. But now he was a general in the French army, at the head of the French army in Haiti. And he managed to keep the invaders out and save the cause of abolition in the Caribbean. So just a few years ago, he had been a humble leader of mules, pretending to be free. And now he was a general who had defeated the 3 main colonial powers of his time, the French planters, and then Spain and Britain. Proud moments. But every time he took 2 steps forward toward liberty, he had a tendency to take a step back. He's a complicated figure again. Because when the British left from Haiti, he negotiated a secret deal with them, whereby he promised that he would not try to start a slave revolt anywhere outside of Haiti, including in British Jamaica. And he even denounced an attempt by a Haitian Jew called Isaac Sasportas, who was trying to export a slave revolt to Jamaica, and Toussaint Louverture denounced the attempted slave revolt, and that person was arrested and executed. And Toussaint Louverture made the same deal with the administration of John Adams in the US. So he safeguarded emancipation in Haiti, but was willing to make deals with slave-owning powers in the area to not export the slave revolt. And also, now that he was in charge of Haiti, having defeated all the enemies, he wanted the plantations to go back to work. Because Haiti, remember, had once been the most successful sugar and coffee exporter in the world. But now, after a decade of war, production was down by more than 90% in Haiti. So he wanted to resume production, except that the former slaves, who are now free, were not that keen on returning to the fields, and we understand why. So Toussaint Louverture created an in-between system that fell halfway between slavery and true freedom, a kind of serfdom that he called the cultivated. And under that system, people were nominally free and they got paid, but working was a requirement, not a choice. And that made him surprisingly controversial in his own time. People admired the intelligence of Toussaint Louverture, they recognized his achievements, but they also resented his stern rule, especially black rank and file workers that were herded back to the plantation. He was feared and respected by all, but he was not loved. But he did allow the plantation economy to recover. And he just continued to move his march forward. In 1801, still as leader of Haiti, he decided to invade the other half of the island of Hispaniola. That island today would be split between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So it's the Spanish Santo Domingo part that he invaded. And then after that, he drafted a constitution that made him governor general for life of the entire islands, French and Spanish part. And that's what is depicted there, where only God is above him. And that was the highest point of his life. There he was, governor of the entire island where he had once been a slave, writing letters to the US president, the British governor of Jamaica, and Napoleon Bonaparte. But no matter how much he tried to break into the white man's club, they never fully accepted him as an equal, and they dismissed him as a kind of a black nouveau riche. And that's where Icarus is going to be falling down from the sun back to Earth, I warn you. The world for Toussaint Louverture really collapsed in 1802 when Napoleon Bonaparte, the first consul of France, became convinced that Toussaint Louverture was taking Haiti toward independence. And Napoleon sent a massive expedition to Haiti to overthrow Toussaint Louverture and possibly restore slavery as well. The leader of that expedition was not Napoleon himself, but his sister and his brother-in-law. And that brother-in-law, General Leclerc, brought with him 43,000 men and 2/3 of the French Navy. So it's a big, big thing, the largest overseas expedition of the consulate. And there's plenty to be said about that momentous conflict, but actually I wrote a whole book on the topic. So I'll just give you the short executive summary today because we're running out of time. So in 1802, the army of Toussaint Louverture managed to fight the army of Napoleon to a draw. Not everybody can say that, not in 1802. And for that, he used scorched earth and guerrilla tactics, a bit like the Russians or the Spanish did later on. Excuse me. But unfortunately for Toussaint Louverture, a few months later, he was captured by treachery and deported to France. And at that point, the Haitian Revolution continued under others, but his destiny came to a rapid end. And the last few months of his life, 1802, 1803, are kind of heartbreaking when you've gotten to know and love the man like I have, because it can be a hard man to decipher. It's very private, but there are a few constants in his life. Number one, he loved his family. And his second wife, his sons, they were taken away from him in captivity. Number two, he was proud to have learned how to write as an adult, to have mastered the written form. But Napoleon, to punish him, ordered that all writing materials be confiscated from Toussaint Louverture in an effort to silence him. And number three, I would say he was proud, and Napoleon knew it and ordered that his uniform of general be taken away from him to humiliate him. He would be a simple civilian again. And I guess number four, you could say, constant in his life is that he was a man from the tropics. He had a sweet tooth, he liked sugar, and never had enough sugar in captivity, and he did not like the cold. And unfortunately, the prison where he was sent to in France is located in the coldest region of France, in the Alps/Jura mountains. To him, that would have been like a stone cold hell. And he fought his way throughout the winter until the morning of April 7th, 1803, when he where he was found dead in his cell. And in his illustration, he's dying in the arms of his servant, but in reality, the servant was gone months before. So the last months of his life, he was alone, and he died alone. So to finish, what do you make of a life like this? Do you say that he was a black nationalist, a precursor to the independence of Haiti, an abolitionist? And yes, he was. That's how he's understood in Haiti. The revolution that he began continued after his exile, and so the second in command, Dessalines, the one who had been a slave once, continued the fight, defeated what remained of the French expedition, and then proclaimed the independence of a free Haiti in 1804, only the second colony to be independent in Latin America after the US. Or should you see him more as a Frenchman, an officer of the French Republic, a planner, a colonist? Well, he was to some extent. The picture you see here is the Pantheon, the Pantheon, we see the monument in Paris where famous French men and women are buried. And there is now a plaque honoring Toussaint Louverture right next to the crypt that houses the heroes of abolition in French history. Because the current French Republic also claims Toussaint Louverture as one of its own heroes, a hero of the French Revolution. So he's also torn between those two places. So he was all these things, and we're back to the Rorschach test. He was a slave, he was a planner, he was a Frenchman, he was a Haitian. And so to all these questions, who was he? I would say, well, all of the above. That's the correct answer to the multiple choice test. So to me, his ideology was not either or. To me, it was and. He tried to reconcile the needs of plantation agriculture with the idea of liberty, which was hard. He tried to serve an empire, the French colonial empire, while claiming political autonomy. He was a black nationalist, and he was a Frenchman. He was all of the above. And to finish, I would like to use the words that Toussaint Louverture used when he finished his letters. You see it here. It's a traditional greeting in Haiti. Salut, respect. That would be how he ended his letters. And I'm now ready for questions.
Yeah, you could put your questions in the chat if you have any questions. I have a question. So you said he was a complex figure, like he didn't totally he didn't abolish slavery.
Uh,
Um, but he's still obviously very well respected in Haiti, but how are certain elements do people are like look critically upon certain elements of his history at this stage?
yeah, it's a good question. This has changed over time. Right after the Haitian Revolution, he was fairly poorly regarded in Haiti, precisely because people remembered him as maybe a person that only led the revolution halfway through independence and halfway through full emancipation. And so many other veterans of the revolution tended to bury his image in a way to aggrandize themselves. This has changed in recent time. Nowadays in Haiti, he is seen as the great hero. Dessalines is the only other one that can compare. I'll show you a picture of that high school named after him on the side of his plantation. If you go to Haiti, you will land in Port-au-Prince, most likely. You'll land at Touissaint Louverture Airport. He'll be on the banknotes. He is a national hero. Mostly because people now get the airbrush version of his life. He has been turned into that one-dimensional character where he was a former slave. He led the Haitian Revolution. He freed the slaves, and he wanted to have independence for Haiti, except the bad Napoleon captured him before the end. Which is a simplified version of his life. And that's what people learn in Haiti. I remember going to a conference in Port-au-Prince or Pétionville about 5 years ago, where I gave a talk a bit similar to this one about my findings on his early life. And I know that people were mad about that. How is a Frenchman from another colony in the Caribbean, Guadeloupe, which has remained French, so I'm already suspicious in the eyes of many Haitians, dares to come in and insult the great leader and portray him as that complex figure that was not 100% devoted to freedom at every moment of his life. That made people mad because that did not fit his image. But we have the same thing in the US. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, for the longest time, was portrayed in American schools as this hero of the Declaration of Independence. And only recently are people being told, well, remember, he also had slaves, and his relationship with Sally Hemings could be, described as a form of rape. And people are mad about the destruction of the great founding fathers. So you have the same kind of debate going on as to how you describe the founding father of Haiti in Haiti as you would have for the founding father of the US in the US. And we have the same debate in France when it comes to Napoleon. It's also a complex figure who is being reevaluated right now, and some people are mad about it.
Also, you mentioned Black Jacobins. That was kind of how I was introduced. So is that I think you said it was kind of an older document, but is it still considered it's still considered relevant and still considered a major source?
It's the kind of work that we would describe as groundbreaking. In his time, It's the kind of work that really pushed the scholarship forward. It's the first account of the Haitian Revolution published outside of Haiti that actually was based on extensive research. And it did a lot to put the Haitian Revolution in the grand narrative of Atlantic Revolution, where people only spoke of American Revolution, the French Revolution, and forgot about Haiti. James is the one that told others, well, wait a minute, there is that other revolution that is just as relevant and actually went much further than the American and French Revolution ever did. So that's groundbreaking in that regard. It was written from a very specific kind of perspective. C.L.R. James was a person from the Caribbean. He was a Marxist. So there's also that element. It has a strong political agenda behind it. So I would not dismiss it at all. It's just that the first edition is 1938, and we historians do some work sometimes, and we discover things sometimes. And as a result, there are quite a few discoveries about Touissaint Louverture that have happened in the past 10, 20, 30 years that C.L.R. James was not aware of. That we need to add to it. So if I were leading a graduate level class about the topic, I would definitely say, well, you have to read C.L.R. James. It's not the last word on it. A lot of work has been done in the past 100 years, but it is a groundbreaking book in its time.
And I think I remember. So Bonaparte wasn't always an adversary of Toussaint.
Correct. It's a complicated, another complicated thing. Napoleon got to power in 1799. That's when he does a coup d'état of 18 Brumaire. And initially, he can't really do anything about the situation in the French Caribbean because France is at war with England. The British Navy dominated the French Navy time and time again in the Revolution. So even if Napoleon had wanted to do anything about Toussaint Louverture, he couldn't because there's just no way to send troops across the Atlantic to overthrow Toussaint Louverture. And Napoleon is a very pragmatic person. So the first couple of years, he just says, well, Toussaint Louverture is in charge. He seems to have put former slaves back to plantation to work. Well, that's it. I'm just going to make a strategic alliance. And Napoleon was really hoping that the army of Toussaint Louverture, composed of former black slaves, could be used for his offensive goals to attack maybe British Jamaica and score a major coup there. Or maybe during the quasi-war, there's a period when France and the US are almost in a state of war. They have some plans to invade the southern US. So that's his goal, to maintain a good friendly relationship with Toussaint Louverture to possibly attack the US South or Jamaica. That changed later on by 1801 because there's a period where France and Britain made a temporary peace during the French Revolution. It's called the Peace of Amiens. So there's a very short period of time, a couple of years, where France and Britain are at peace, which allowed Napoleon for the first time to think, well, maybe I can send an army now to Haiti if I want to explore other options. And right around that time, Napoleon heard a number of stories about how Toussaint Louverture had mistreated some French agents in the colony and had passed that constitution all on his own that made him governor general for life, as if he was the leader of his own union, and had done some secret diplomacy with the British and Americans. And he learned a lot of things that angered him. And because of that timing, that's when you have that rift. So the relationship between the two is very complicated. They are similar in many ways. I mean, there are both people from faraway corners of France, Corsica or Haiti. They're both insular people who grew up during roughly the same period, became successful because of the French Revolution. They're both womanizers. They're both generals. They're both pragmatic. They're both very ambitious. You could put them side by side, and they're very, very similar to the point where Louverture is often described as the Black Napoleon, or I would describe Napoleon as the white Toussaint. But there's also maybe the reason why the two eventually clash, because they are so similar in many ways.
See any questions here? So are there any like Toussaint? Is he like are there any like works of fiction that are relevant that he's like portrayed in? I mean, I don't I don't think he's migrated here to American film or anything. But are there any like relevant works of fiction?
Not not as famous, I would say, because whenever I study Haitian history, I'm always impressed by the number of incredible stories that they have. You know, if you want to be in Hollywood, you want sex, you want violence, you want upheavals. I mean, you got everything, and the exoticism of the tropics. I'm surprised that yeah, Hollywood hasn't jumped on it. As far as movies, there's an old movie from the '60s with Marlon Brando uh, by Gillo Pontecorvo. He was a very political filmmaker at the time. The movie is called Burn, also known as Quemada, but Burn, I think, the English title, which is not directly based on Toussaint Louverture, but it's about the slave revolt in the Caribbean, and the main leader in it is modeled after Toussaint Louverture. And Marlon Brando plays the role of a white British agent that encourages him to revolt. So there's that. In fiction, he has appeared in some works, but not that many. Like Victor Hugo has one of his novels, Bug Jargal, that is inspired from that. It's not the most famous novel, but it's one of them. Lamartine was a famous French playwright, has a book that's about him, a play that was somewhat successful in the 19th century. Probably the most well-known novel outside of Haiti would be one called The Kingdom of This World. It's by Alejo Carpentier, who was a Cuban writer, who was the founder of the magical realist school in Latin America. That whole school of novels that kind of mix magic and reality. Works like Gabriel Garcia Lorca or Isabel Allende. They're all from that school. The founder of that was Alejo Carpentier, and his novel that started the whole movement, The King of His World, is set during the Haitian Revolution. And that saying of being based on real events of the Haitian Revolution, and some characters in there are based on Toussaint Louverture. And then you have some magic, obviously, it's magical realism. So voodoo pops up, and you have some magical stuff that happens. But as far as really fully exploring the events of that period, no, that is not as explored as it could be.
Don't see any more questions. So I guess if we have no more questions, I'd just like to thank Philippe Girard for this great presentation, this great informative presentation. And please check out his book. I don't know if we have a copy yet in the library, but I will definitely make sure. I believe it was on back order last time I checked. Yeah, and we got a thank you from Farah. Yeah. And also check out our social media for our upcoming events. And thanks again.
Okay,
Have a great night,
thank you very
everyone.
much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.